All right. So our next section we're going to talk about is the lost cause of the Confederacy movement. And when we talk about whitewashing in this country, this is one of the bigger ways that we whitewash our history. Arguably one of the most impactful ways. So we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of what the cause is and how it arises through a section. But ultimately, the lost cause was about whitewashing the history of slavery, kind of downplaying slavery, making it seem like it wasn't that bad. Whitewashing Confederate leaders, making it seem like instead of them fighting for slavery, they were actually fighting against Northern oppression, and it also whitewashed what happened after slavery. So we know after slavery, slavery didn't go away; it just evolved into these systems of Jim Crow and lynching and a racial, a criminal justice system based on racism and the black, myth of black criminality. So what the lost cause did is it kind of erased all this, and that's super important to understand because that helps explain where we are today. Because it's not just about selling a more pleasant, happy history. It's about disconnecting the past to the legacy that our past created, to the racial disparities that are being felt today, the racial injustices that are being felt today. So if you disconnect that past, if you white race Jim Crow, race lynching, make slavery seem like it was actually an okay thing that didn't really impact this country that much. So if you sell this history and this narrative, which was being sold, to millions of white people, in textbooks and media and culture and history, in family histories and things, and monuments. So when you do that, what it ultimately does is it erases, the reason for the disparities today, the reason for the racial injustice today. And now that when you erase that, it's much easier to sell these new narratives that black people or just indigenous people are just not trying hard enough. They're not taking enough personal responsibility. We've done enough for them with the civil rights bills in the 60s. Now it's up to them. So they sell these narratives. That affirmative action is actually reverse racism, and that white people are actually under constant attack by these social justice advocates. So it's a lot easier to sell these narratives, and then on top of that, it's a lot easier to turn these narratives and the people believing in them into votes. Into votes for politicians that are continuing to push white supremacy policies and racist policies. And we see this even with this last election, President Trump, who create a platform on racist policies, and spent the last 4 years implementing these racist policies, to the suffering of millions of people. Trump still got 74 million votes in this past election, and that a large part of that is the fact that our history has been erased for so many people, has been whitewashed, to the point that these people see any attempt to try to fix the legacy of our past as an attack onto white people or an attack onto themselves, in general. So that a lot of that comes from the lost cause of Confederacy. So that's what we're going to be exploring during this section. So I'll start off with Brian Stevenson, a quote. He says, "We need to understand the greater evil of American slavery wasn't involuntary servitude and forced labor. It was the idea that black people aren't as good as white people, that they're not fully human. The Supreme Court said we're 3/5 human, and that created this ideology of white supremacy that we never addressed. The North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war. They weren't required to repudiate and acknowledge the wrongfulness of bigotry and slavery. They actually glorified that area, and that created a century where black people were pulled out of their homes, beaten, drowned, hanged in this era of terrorism, but we haven't talked about it today." And that's really important to understand, that even though the South lost the Civil War physically, they have won, arguably are continuing to win the narrative war. And that's the narrative of how we define, what Civil War was fought for, and the legacy of that was that war. So I want to start off with James Powell's, sorry, John Powell. I played the bits of this lecture. He gives this amazing speech during on the construction of whiteness and the anti-black symposium in 2019. But he has this really. I just want to play a real quick clip that talks about how the South, really actually won the Civil War and how we're still fighting it in many different ways.
Coexist with blackness. Now think about this. So we have slavery, and then slavery ends, or at least it changes, because we move very quickly in the United States to sharecropping. And we have new mechanisms to contain the apparently free blacks. And as someone said, even though the North won the Civil War in the United States, and blacks won the war in South Africa, and Brazil didn't have a war, the most virulent whites actually prevail. So the laws of segregation, the laws of anti-miscegenation, the laws of disinvestment, the laws of policing people, the laws of racial profiling all come from the southern expression of whiteness in the United States, the most virulent whites in Brazil, and the Afrikanders in South Africa. So they lost the war, but they're winning the social construct. Trump is not, to use just to name it, Trump is not a descendant of Lincoln. He's a descendant of Jefferson Davis. And I sometimes say in the United States, we're fighting the Civil War, it's no longer a Civil War. It's a national war, and the South is winning. And winning in Wisconsin, winning in Michigan, winning in California, winning in Brazil.
All right. And we'll play one more video kind of setting the context of this before we jump into what that lost cause was actually about. So this is a really quick video by Brian Stevenson that talks about how slavery really didn't end in 1865. It just evolved in multiple different ways. I want to read this first quote before I play the video. Though legally emancipated from slavery, endowed with constitutional rights and to participate in society as full citizens, Black people soon learned that those rights were unenforceable in a white-controlled political system hostile to their exercise. This message was communicated through an intricate and complex system of racial subordination built after the Civil War to maintain and reinforce white supremacy in a world without chattel slavery. Constructed of law and custom, force and fear, disenfranchisement, then convict leasing and Jim Crow segregation, the system was fragile and fiercely guarded. So we had a whole class on the foundations of white supremacy. There we talked about how slavery evolved into the many different ways, from Jim Crow to lynching to racial justice system, and how those systems evolved to many of our systems that we have today, such as mass incarceration, racial, the racial wealth gaps, and all the different disparities that we're feeling today, so that's really important to understand, because when we talk about the lost cause, we're not just talking about slavery, we're talking about the legacy of slavery and how it evolved in this country.
Black people were pulled out of their homes, they were mutilated, they were hanged, lynching in America. We had community violence perpetrated against African Americans that were just absolutely devastating. So there is this legacy of slavery, and it created a consciousness that Black people could be mistreated, could be abused, or truly decades of terrorism, violence. Legacy of slavery, violence and terror that it unearthed is part of what we have to address. I don't think slavery ended in 1865. I think it just evolved. The true evil of American slavery was this narrative of racial difference that we created to justify it. It was the ideology of white supremacy that argued that Black people were different than white people, that Black people can't do this, they can't do that, they're not fully evolved, they're not fully human. That's why I continue to believe we're not ready. It's creating an assumption of dangerousness, finally was moved indoors, it was replaced by a criminal justice system that is just as violent and sometimes just as brutal as menacing people of color by our police, by our systems of criminal justice, and that frightening, that menacing, and that tolerance of inequality and injustice. We never held people accountable in communities where thousands of people died to celebrate these acts. You won't find markers, you won't find symbols, you won't find statements. Find totems and iconography celebrating the legacy of the Confederacy, the ideology of white supremacy.
Right. So in that, it will stop it right there. But on that note, of this idea that we had this horrific history, instead of anyone acknowledging it or learning from it or repudiating it, instead it's just buried under all these iconographies of Confederacies and Confederate soldiers who fought for this horrific history. And that's where comes in the lost cause and Confederacy movement. So we'll play a couple videos and talk about a couple different perspectives on what this cause was about. But just want to talk about a little bit about the founding principles of this cause. So this cause is responsible for the lost cause of Confederacy, is responsible for the vast majority, if not all, the Confederate monuments that we see throughout this day. I'm not saying all, but I'd say definitely the vast majority of Confederate monuments and statues. This is responsible for textbooks that are downplaying slavery and upplaying and glorifying Confederate histories. It's responsible for people that claiming that being proud of it, for the heritage of enslavers and people who fought a war to continue enslaving people. So a lot, it's been very impactful. But this movement, it didn't, this movement was really focused on, kind of downplaying the Civil War and glorifying the Confederates fighting the Civil War. But it wasn't like its movement emerged right after the Civil War. In fact, it was decades afterwards that we start seeing this movement to glorify Confederate heroes and generals and build monuments. This really movement started really when the rise of Jim Crow, and as we start seeing resistance against the Jim Crow and civil rights movements against Jim Crow and versus Plessy versus Ferguson in the 1800s and early 1900s, that's when we see a vast majority of these monuments being built. And then we see another huge push to build these monuments in the civil rights movements. That's because this movement wasn't so much about glorifying the Civil War, but it was more about pushing the same white supremacy and intimidating Black people with the same white supremacy, and letting everyone know that the white supremacy still dictates this world by naming Black schools after Confederate generals who fought a war to enslave Black people, by putting monuments on courthouses, of generals that helped lynch people, Black people. So that it was a way to kind of push this continued white supremacy in the South, and eventually it was pushed throughout this country. So this was a propaganda movement. It started in the South, very focused on whitewashing the Civil War and slavery. But it was particularly used to counter any kind of resistance to white supremacy, resistance against Jim Crow and civil rights movements and things like that. And this movement is still continuing to this day. We could see that, anytime that we try to take down a Confederate statue, we see a whole movement of resistance against that. And that's, people who have grown up in this, these narratives of a lost cause. So the three main things that it was focused on was downplaying the horrors of slavery, downplaying the role of slavery it had in the Civil War, making Confederates heroes, and then depicting the Civil War and Reconstruction that followed afterwards. That brief moment when we tried to create an egalitarian society in the South, and that was ultimately overthrown by white supremacy. But these two narratives of depicting the Civil War and depicting the Reconstruction as actually Northern aggression, and it depicted that the South as actually the victims of the Civil War, and the victims of Reconstruction, the victims of a oppressive, corrupt northern government that was trying to control them and what they were doing. So it really, completely, changes the narrative, or changes the history of the Civil War. These ideas. So there was multiple different organizations like the Daughters of the Confederacy and all these other organizations that raised money and it had chapters throughout the country, and they all pushed to get these narratives into school textbooks. And they pushed to censor any kind of textbooks that was critical of the South or critical of slavery. They pushed for museums and movies and books and religion and government holidays, monuments, memorials, reenactments, all these things to kind of push this false narrative. The United Daughters Confederacy was a big organization, but also like KKK, White Citizens Councils, all different kinds of people were pushing for these new narratives. And particularly, we saw as white resentment increased against Black civil rights efforts, that's when the propaganda really started taking hold. That's when Confederate symbols and memorials, like the idea, like a lot of these states that have Confederate flags as their state, that didn't happen after the Civil War. That happened in like the 50s, when there was as in response to civil rights movements. So Ibn Khaldun writes, he writes, when Southerners complained of their lost cause and appalled President Grant, Grant was one of the generals during the time during the Reconstruction who was like fighting, using the military to fight to protect Black people in the South against the KKK and terrorism and voter suppression. But and appalled President Grant realized they were complaining of their lost freedom to kill Negroes and Republicans without fear of punishment, without loss of caste or reputations. So what Grant was realizing at this time is the South, when they were playing victims, when they were acting like victims, when they were writing all these narratives about them being victims of what they were being victimized was they were being robbed of the ability to essentially enslave Black people and kill Black people without consequences. So that's the lost cause. That's the cause they lost. So I want to play this Vox video. It talks about just how a lot of these organizations like United Daughters of Confederacy, how they were able to kind of insert these narratives into curriculum and textbooks and culture throughout this entire country.
Listen to how this textbook describes slavery. The master often had a barbecue or a picnic for his slaves. Then they had a great frolic. Even while working in the cotton fields, they sang songs. The beat of the music and the richness of their voices made work seem light. Yikes, that's from History of Georgia, a textbook published in 1954 that was taught across junior high schools in Georgia for decades. That sort of language is part of an intellectual movement called the Lost Cause, a distorted version of American Civil War history that's been prevalent in the South for a long time. It took shape soon after the defeat of the Confederate States in the war, when Southern historians like Edward Pollard and former Confederate General Jubal Early started preserving the South's perspective through their writings. They framed the Confederate cause as a heroic defense of the Southern way of life against the overwhelming forces in the North. That narrative has a few basic tenets: the glorification of Confederate soldiers who died for a cause they believed in, the belief that slavery was a benevolent institution, and maybe most importantly, that slavery was not the root cause of the war. The Lost Cause is one of the most notoriously effective efforts to rewrite history, and it was done by the losing side. So how did it become so deeply rooted in Southern memory? Blame the United Daughters of the Confederacy. The UDC was founded in Nashville in 1894 to preserve Confederate culture for generations to come. The women who made up the group descended from elite antebellum families, and they used their social and political clout to spread the pro-Southern version of the war as real history. You've probably seen their efforts to honor the Confederacy, but maybe you didn't know it was the UDC. They're the ones who covered the Southern landscape with memorials for Confederate leaders and soldiers. They used their fundraising and lobbying skills to pressure local governments into erecting monuments in prominent public spaces like courthouses and state capitals.
Installed here next to the state capitol by the United Daughters of the Confederacy.
The United Daughters of the Confederacy donated this memorial to the city Back in the 30s, they put them along roadsides and in parks. Any place that was remotely relevant to the Confederacy was memorialized. By the early 20th century, the UDC had 100,000 members, and chapters spread all over the country, but mostly in former Confederate states. And there's a reason they grew so quickly during that time.
So we're talking about roughly 3 decades after the end of the war, and the Confederate veterans themselves are beginning to die off. So there is this push to find ways to commemorate it, because the big challenge by 1900 was there's a new generation of white Southerners being born, and they never experienced the war years.
That push is visible. Most of the Confederate monuments were erected during the UDC's height of influence.
There's a rhetoric around monuments that we want to get this thing built before all of that generation has died off. And the reason we want it is to teach future generations about those men.
Dr. Karen Cox wrote the book on the UDC, and I asked her if it was fair to say the group established the Lost Cause as historical fact in the South.
Oh my God, yeah. They were the leaders of the Lost Cause into the 20th century, and they made it a movement about vindication.
Just to give you an idea of how effective they were, they successfully lobbied for a Confederate memorial in Arlington National Cemetery, which U.S. President Woodrow Wilson proudly unveiled to a cheering crowd. Now that's influence, right?
Monuments are the least of what they did.
What?
I mean, they are the most visible and tangible, but the work with children was far more influential.
It turns out a central UDC objective is shaping how children think about the war and their Southern heritage. One of their most powerful tools? Textbooks. Take a look at this pamphlet called A Measuring Rod for Textbooks. It was written by the illustrious Southern historian Miss Mildred Rutherford, an educator, orator, and author of Southern history textbooks. She's also very pro-slavery. The pamphlet announced the formation of a textbook review committee featuring prominent Southerners like 5 former Confederate generals. This group was committed to spreading the truths of Confederate history, so they instructed school boards to reject any textbooks that did not accord full justice to the South. And they urged libraries to deface every book in their collection that didn't measure up by writing the words "unjust to the South" clearly on its cover. This pamphlet was shared widely with school boards throughout the South, and UDC-backed committees closely monitored history books to make sure Northern influence never reached classrooms. So the core language of an approved textbook aligned precisely with that of the Lost Cause. You know, stuff like,
"The Confederacy lost in the war between the states, but Georgia never forgot to honor her Confederate soldiers."
History of Georgia was on the UDC's approved list. It was also written by E. Merton Coulter, a self-described Southern historian and historian-described white supremacist.
They understand that how you educate, who wins the writing game, who wins the battle over history, ultimately wins the war. That's the big fight for the UDC.
But their work with children went further than the classrooms. The UDC formed an auxiliary group called the Children of the Confederacy, which was designed to get kids born in former Confederate states to actively participate in their version of history. Group leaders had kids recite call and response truths from something called the Confederate Catechism. Children up to the age of 18 would compete and be rewarded for memorizing long passages of Lost Cause rhetoric.
So it would be like an after-school thing, like that was your club. You would go after school to the meeting of the Children of the Confederacy, and your leader might teach you songs of the South, like Dixie or other songs that were considered Southern patriotic songs. They would have them write essays, go visit the veterans, and learn this catechism.
Children were also the centerpiece of their community's monument unveilings, like this living flag at the dedication of the Stonewall Jackson Monument in Richmond. Yes, those are school children. The UDC's efforts shaped the identities of children who grew up with the Lost Cause. They made history personal, and that made their story last longer.
Generations of children learning that narrative in a variety of ways grow up to be, segregationists in the 50s and 60s, because that's been drilled into them since they were children.
After World War I, the UDC started losing steam, but the damage was done. The monuments were in place, and the textbooks they wrote remained in Southern classrooms until the late 70s. And the women's group did it all without the right to vote or participate in politics.
You can still get glimmers of this Lost Cause memory of the war from people who will always choose to see it through the personal. And I think the UDC, to a great extent, was their goal.
So the next time someone says the Confederate monuments are about remembering our history, just know that that's exactly what the United Daughters of the Confederacy wants you to think.
So 2 things I wanted to follow up on this video is, one is this idea of making history personal, and we see this, with a lot of people who are bought into this lost cause, when you try to talk to them about slavery or try to talk to them about Jim Crow or lynching, there's immediate resistance because they're arguing about facts. They're arguing because this is my heritage, and that was a big push for the lost cause, was to create this new history, this narrative, and get enough people to believe it as heritage. So now, no matter what comes out about General Lee, how horrible of a slave owner he was and how horrific he treated black people, that will never stick because that is now considered heritage and it's considered personal to a lot of people growing up in the South. There's this that defense against trying to be critical or trying to understand our history or and particularly we're trying to understand our history and how it relates to now. There's a resistance to that, and that's because the daughters of United Daughters of Confederacy have made this new narrative personal, made people believe that it's their heritage instead of so now if we try to attack General Lee, you're not just attacking General Lee, you're personally attacking everyone that grew up in the South, every white person that grew up in the South, who has bought into this narrative. So that's really important because that's a very strong defense for this whitewashing. And the second part I wanted to talk about is how they talked about how a lot of these kids who grew up in these these educational camps and grew up reading these textbooks, were in the 50s and 60s were the people fighting racial segregation, were the people yelling at, black kids for trying to, or causing violence, I mean, they were the people that carried out the lynching throughout the first half of the 20th century. I mean, and that not just, and that created environments. I mean, they did this, they brought their kids to public lynchings. They brought their kids to these protests against school desegregation, and then those kids are the ones that are growing up today, and they're the ones that are so pushing this narrative that this is their heritage, and that affirmative actions reverse racism, and that they're the ones voting for openly racist politicians. They're pushing racist policies because they're the ones that are believing that white people are under attack when in reality, for any kind of racial progress. So it's important to kind of understand how this is, this was done a century ago. This is, still very much part of our culture. And even to the date, I mean, many of these textbooks, I mean, the official Daughters of a Revolutionary textbooks were taught till the 70s, and most of those are gone, but the legacy of that is we still see this. We're going to talk a little bit later about, the textbooks that we're still seeing today and how that, legacy is still wrapped up into these textbooks. So James Lowen, who writes "The Lies My Teacher Told Me," wrote this really great quote about the lost cause. The Confederates won with the pen and the noose what they could not win on the battlefield, the cause of white supremacy and the dominant understanding of what the war was all about. We are still digging ourselves out from under the misinformation they spread, which has manifested in our own public monuments and our history books. Take Kentucky, where the legislation voted not to secede. Eventually, 90,000 Kentuckians would fight for the United States, while 35,000 would fought for the Confederate States. Nevertheless, according to historian Thomas Clark, the state now has 72 Confederate monuments and only 2 Union ones. Perhaps most perniciously, neo-Confederates now claim that the South ceded over states' rights, yet when each state left the Union, its leaders made clear that they were seceding because they were for slavery and against states' rights to resist resist the Fugitive Slave Act. We'll talk more about that in a second. So thoroughly did this mythology take hold that our textbooks still stand history on its head and say secession was for rather than against states' rights. Publishers mystify secession because they don't want to offend Southern school districts and thereby lose sales. And we'll talk more about that too as, later on in this presentation, of how large, textbook purchasers like the state of Texas actually dictates a lot of our curriculum for across our country, because what they vote to approve, textbooks, because they're such a large buyer of textbooks, many textbooks will actually draft their curriculum towards what their school board, their state school board votes for, and their state school board oftentimes is very Republican and very, very pro whitewashing. So, and that affects all, a lot of textbooks throughout this country. So it's important to understand. We'll talk more about that later on in this section. But I wanted just to show you, just to back up, James Llewellyn's claim that that every state, that one of the biggest, myths of the lost cause is the fact that the Confederates fought for states' rights. When if you look at every single state that seceded, the southern state that seceded and fought with the Confederates, every one of their secession speeches or secession resolutions or declarations, they all specifically mention, the institution of African slavery, slave holding. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, and a blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. Texas, their benefit and patriarchal system of African slavery. Arkansas, the rights of slave states. Virginia, proposals are hostile to slavery. So it was 100% clear that the South seceded because to protect the institution of slavery and to protect white supremacy. I remember growing up, being taught that was like one of like 5 or 6 different reasons why the Civil War affected. States' rights being the most important, and then slavery being on the bottom of that list. So this is a powerful myth that's been pushed throughout this country, and in reality, many people believe in the states' rights narrative. And the fact that many southern states actually, they openly oppose states' rights, particularly around, northern states would often, pass legislation, state legislation that opposed or prevented them from enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act was a federal law that basically said if slaves, enslaved people escaped the South, the North had to, bring them back to the South, and the northern states passed a lot of laws to get around that. So actually, southern states were very openly hostile towards states' rights and believed that all northern states had to, respect the federal government. And this only changed, after Lincoln was, elected, and all of a sudden, the South wanted the states' rights to continue slavery. But I mean, the South has a long history of opposing states' rights. So this is just one example of many textbooks that the Lost Cause, helped draft. And this textbook was a Virginia textbook between 1957 to 1970s for 4th and 11th graders, and it's estimated to reach, over 1 million students during this time period. And this textbook said, it said slaves were happy, often referring to them as servants. It glorified Confederates. So contact between English settlers and Virginia Indians resulted in a better life for both the settlers and Indians. Said precious little about women beyond Martha Washington and Pocahontas, cast the state segregationist political leaders in a favorable light, saying General Lee was a handsome man who sat straight and firm on the saddle. Lee's horse, Traveler, stepped proudly as if he knew that he carried a great general. And then taught many lost cause beliefs. So this was just one example of many textbooks, particularly around the South, but a lot of these textbooks also made their way across this country as well. And we still find, even though a lot of the official lost cause textbooks, were kind of banned or stopped being published in the 70s, we still find a lot of the legacy of a lot of these narratives still included in textbooks that we're using today. So I want to play a real quick clip on the history of the Confederate statues.
This Confederate statue comes down with just a tiny tug and then crumples up like a paperclip when it lands. Why does it fall apart so easily? Because it was mass-produced, quickly, cheaply, and most importantly, for a very specific purpose. Take a look at this timeline of when Confederate monuments went up. You'll notice that the bulk of them didn't go up during or even shortly after the Civil War, but during 2 specific periods.
It came at the turn of the century when white Southerners were attempting to disfranchise Black people, and the second burst came in resistance to Black civil rights and political rights in the 1960s. It's very predictable.
Instead of paying tens of thousands of dollars for a granite or a marble statue, a business like Monumental Bronze Company could whip you up a Confederate monument for just a couple $100. And if your little town couldn't afford one, well, then a group called the United Daughters of the Confederacy would chip in, which is why you see their name on monuments everywhere. This is the same group that pushed for textbooks that exclude Black history and promote the idea that the South actually went to war over states' rights. All of this rewriting of history perpetuates an ideology called the lost cause, a mythos that says the Confederacy wasn't so much about slavery as it was defending a pastoral antebellum Southern identity. In the lost cause myth, General Robert E. Lee wasn't one of racism's greatest frontline warriors, but was somebody who was actually against slavery and was reluctantly pulled into war for the greater good of defending the South. Never mind that Lee thought slavery made Black people immeasurably better off, that he was a particularly cruel slave master who had waged war on the United States explicitly to defend slavery. The whitewashing of Lee and the true motives of the Confederacy has been happening for 150 years and is still perpetuated at the highest levels of our government and our society.
I don't care whether it's Trump or white supremacists or Southern heritage thinkers. The heritage of the Confederacy is that they made war on the United States because they felt that slavery was threatened and that the only way to protect it was to be a separate and independent country.
Tearing down Confederate monuments isn't about clearing history away. It's about clearing away the fog of mass-produced propaganda that keeps us from seeing our history the way it truly happened, and the legacy of slavery that still lives on with us today.
All right, so just to give you a little background, you keep on seeing this timeline of, and I should have. I'm trying to remember who officially did this timeline. I think it was National Geographic or one of those, or maybe. It's important to understand. So this is a timeline that points out all the different, monuments and whether there's schools need being named after Confederate, generals, monuments or other, types of monuments, and it shows the different timelines of when they were built. And there was a few, but not a whole lot during the Civil War and during after the Civil War. It was mainly during this time period, the 1900s to 1920s. Where a lot of them was built, and then there was a second smaller wave during the 1950s and 60s during the civil rights movements. And during this time, this was during like Plessy versus Ferguson. This was when Jim Crow was really establishing itself, and when there was resistance, legal resistance, there was protests, things like that. Resistance. There was protests against lynching. There was pushes to get lynching bills, and there's pushes for more civil rights laws. There was a lot of civil rights acts that were passed after the Civil War that were being, essentially dismantled by a very, white supremacy Supreme Court. So we see a lot of the monuments kind of being built during this time, really to kind of push this idea that white supremacy is still the law of this country, so over 1,700 statues were erected all over this country. This is a map of all the statues and monuments, and yet, it wasn't a whole lot, but there was still some in the west and the north. But you see that just a huge amount in the south, and this, And Samantha Bee, writes, she wrote this quote that I really enjoyed. She said, most Confederate monuments went up during the Jim Crow era, the civil rights movement in the 70s. They are less about helping white people remember their heritage and more about intimidating Black people. I want to play this video from the ACU Deputy Legal Director, Jeffrey Robinson, and he talks a little bit more about the myths around these Confederate statues.
America is a great country. And America is a country that was founded on the premise of white supremacy and white superiority. I know you have heard in this entire debate, well, there's a difference between heritage and hate, and there's a difference between Southern culture and slavery, and the monuments are celebrating heritage, they're celebrating culture, they're celebrating Southern pride, and people have understood these code words for a long time. So, I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. And what greets me as a citizen of Tennessee when I go to my state capital in Nashville, where my grandparents lived? Nathan Bedford Forrest. Well, he made a fortune in Memphis as a slave trader. And he was the original Grand Wizard of the KKK. He led a Confederate massacre of black soldiers and white soldiers, American soldiers, during the Civil War. And this monument wasn't put up in 1865 or 1866 with people saying he's such a hero, we have to recognize him. This monument was built in 1970, 2 years after Martin Luther King was shot in the neck just down the road from Nashville, Tennessee. And we'll come to that timing as we go through this, because the timing of these monuments, I think, suggests something that's very important in terms of understanding what they're about. When were these monuments built? There were 2 spikes between the end of the 1800s and about 1921. What else was going on at the exact same time in America? The fact that this was normal, the fact that this was behavior that didn't really shock anybody, tells you something about how deeply white supremacy has been ingrained into American culture. 1921. The black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma was one of the most prosperous communities in America, and the whites there decided they weren't gonna have it. So they simply burned it to the ground. Almost 300 people killed. That's what was going on at the exact same time. Was this explosion of Confederate monuments, an explosion of thanks and praise for people who had done nothing other than fight to maintain white supremacy and slavery. When you think about when these monuments were built and what else was going on in America, it tells you something about the motivation. So how about that second, 1947 to 1968? One thing that people forget about our history is that Reconstruction after the Civil War was actually working. There were over 2,000 black elected officials in America. Businesses that blacks were starting to take hold. And in 1877, I think it was Grover, I can't remember the president, but he got elected and basically said, I'm withdrawing the troops. In 1876, there were 125,000 black registered voters in Louisiana. In 1878, that number dropped to 5,000. And if you're wondering about the flag, it had essentially been dead and buried until 1948, when Strom Thurmond brought it back with the Dixiecrat Party. And once again, they are telling us as clearly as they can what they are about and why they're waving that flag. The party's purpose was clear. We stand for segregation of the races. This is from the editor of the Augusta, Georgia Courier in 1951. Folks, they are saying it as plainly as they can. And yet we are still having a debate in this country about what this stuff means. I am going through this to try and show you the events that were happening at the same time that this second explosion of monuments in the South to Confederate heroes was being built. And then this happened in '63. Segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, and just a few weeks later, the Confederate flag was flying over the University of Alabama. And in September of 1963, these 4 girls got blown up in this church. This was the young girl that survived. These are the faces of people watching the bodies being taken out of the church. This is what was happening as the second explosion of Confederate monuments was happening in America.
All right. So the video goes on for a while. It's definitely worth watching the whole clip. So I want to add a couple really great quotes about this idea that this is our history or our heritage, and we shouldn't bring it down. Ruth, H. Hopkins writes, "Privilege is saying Confederacy statues because privilege is saving Confederate statues because they're historic, but bulldozing through ancient sacred sites and artifacts for pipelines." Nick Estes, a historian, writes, "Tearing down a statue is not erasing history; it's putting up a statue on land whose original caretakers you can't name is." And this kind of shows you the comparison between the fact that we're erasing indigenous history while claiming this new made up narratives or our actual history. So I want to give I think I'm just going to play one more video kind of talking about the statues and then talking about why they were addressed. This was in New Orleans. Mayor Mitch Ladrue, he gave his 2007 address after they decided to tear down, bring down several different statues. They had to do it in the middle of the night. They were worried about, there's all kinds of resistance and violence. And Ladrue actually lost, lost 37% of his white support for bringing these monuments down. And polls indicated that nearly 9 out of 10 white Louisianans opposed their removal. So that's how much we talk about taking this false history and making it personal, making it people believe it's their heritage. So now when we're bringing down a statue, it's not about correcting the past and correcting it wrong. It's a personal affront to people, white people that live in the South. So I'm going to play this real quick.
But there are also other truths about our city that we must confront. New Orleans was one of America's largest slave markets, a port where hundreds of thousands of souls were bought, sold, and shipped up the Mississippi River to lives of forced labor, of misery, of rape, and of torture. America was a place where nearly 4,000 of our fellow American citizens were lynched, 540 in Louisiana alone, where our courts enshrined separate but equal, where freedom riders were beaten to a bloody pulp. So when people say to me that the monuments in question are history, well, what I just described to you is our history as well. And it is a searing truth. And it immediately begs the question, why there are no slave ship monuments, no prominent markers on public land to remember the lynchings or the slave blocks, nothing to remember this long chapter of our lives of pain, of sacrifice, of shame, all of it happening on the soil of New Orleans. So for those self-appointed defenders of history and the monuments, they are eerily silent on what amounts to historical malfeasance, a lie by omission. There is a difference, you see, between remembrance of history and the reverence of it. For America, New Orleans, it has been a long and winding road, marked by tragedy and triumph, but we cannot be afraid of the truth. As President George W. Bush said at the dedication ceremony for the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and I quote, "A great nation does not hide its history. It faces its flaws and it corrects them." So today I want to speak about why we chose to remove these 4 monuments to the lost cause of the Confederacy, but also how and why this process can move us towards healing and understanding each other. So let's start with the facts. The historic record is clear. Robert E. Lee, Jeff Davis, P.G.T. Beauregard statues were not erected to just honor these men, but as part of a movement which became known as the cult of the lost cause. This cult had one goal and one goal only: through monuments and through other means, to rewrite history to hide the truth, which is that the Confederacy was on the wrong side of humanity. First erected 166 years after the founding of our cities, 19 years after the Civil War. These monuments that we took down were meant to rebrand the history of our city and the ideals of the Confederacy. It is self-evident that these men did not fight for the United States of America. They fought against it. They may have been warriors, but in this cause, they were not patriots. These statues are not just stone and metal. They're not just innocent remembrances of a benign history. These monuments celebrate a fictional, sanitized Confederacy, ignoring the death, ignoring the enslavement, ignoring the terror that it actually stood for. And after the Civil War, these monuments were part of that terrorism, as much as burning a cross on someone's lawn. They were erected purposefully to send a strong message to all who walked in the shadows about who was still in charge in this city. A piece of stone, one stone, both stories history, one story told, one story forgotten, or maybe even purposefully ignored. Now, as clear as it is for me today, for a long time, even though I grew up in one of New Orleans' most diverse neighborhoods, even with my family's proud history of fighting for civil rights, I must have passed by these monuments thousands of times without giving them a second thought. So I'm not judging anybody. I'm not judging people. We all take our own journey on race. I just hope people listen like I did when my dear friend Wynton Marsalis helped me see the truth. He asked me to think about all the people who have left New Orleans because of our exclusionary attitudes. Another friend asked me to consider these four monuments from the perspective of an African-American mother or father trying to explain to their fifth grade daughter why Robert E. Lee sat atop of our city. Can you do it? Can you do it? Can you look into the eyes of this young girl and convince her that Robert E. Lee is there to encourage her? Do you think that she feels inspired and hopeful by that story? Do these monuments help her see her future with limitless potential? Have you ever thought that if her potential is limited, yours and my potential, my limited potential as well? We all know the answers to these very simple questions. When you look into this child's eyes is the moment when the searing truth comes into focus. This is the moment when we know what we must do, when we know what is right. We cannot walk away from this truth. Now, I knew that taking down these monuments was going to be tough, but you elected me to do the right thing, not the easy thing. And this is what that looks like. So relocating these monuments is not about taking something away from someone else. This is not about politics. It's not about blame. It's not about retaliation. This is not about a naive quest to solve all of our problems at once. This is, however, about showing the whole world that we as a city, that we as a people are able to acknowledge, to understand, to reconcile, and more importantly, choose a better future for ourselves, making straight what has been crooked and making right what was wrong. Otherwise, we will continue to pay a price with discord, with division, and violence. To literally put the Confederacy on a pedestal in our most prominent places, in honor, is an inaccurate recitation of our full past, is an affront to our present, and it is a bad prescription for our future. History cannot be changed. It cannot be moved like a statue. What's done is done. The Civil War is over. The Confederacy lost. And we're better for it. Surely we are far enough removed from this dark time to acknowledge that the cause of the Confederacy was wrong. And in the second decade of the 21st century, asking African Americans, or anyone else for that matter, to drive by property that they own, occupied by reverential statues of men who fought to destroy the country and deny that person's humanity, seems perverse. It seems absurd. Century-old wounds are still raw because, you see, they never healed right in the first place. So here...
All right. So yeah, really great speech. So I want to show this map. So SPLC is Southern Poverty Law Center. We'll be talking a bunch about them lately. They've done a lot to kind of expose the legacy of the lost cause today. But they actually created this map, outline all the monuments in this country. And if you want to know, if you want to do research, go to this and find. If you want to find out if there are monuments in your town, this can actually help you. And this could be the start of a campaign to actually bring these monuments down. So I definitely encourage everyone to check out this map and find out, what is in your area. All right, so last video, this is like a minute real quick, but I'm gonna play. This is definitely overlapping. Some of these videos are overlapping, but I just want to play this last 1 minute clip of a Daily Show with Jon Stewart talking about the monuments, and then we're going to move on to monuments.
People shouldn't have, for 100 years, the statues are not from the Confederate era, they're from the Jim Crow era. They're from the era when they built them to say, just so you know, I know they let you go, but I just want to make sure everybody understands, we will still subjugate you. I hope that's, and bring fear into your life. So, because these statues are not, people say you're erasing our history, which, by the way, I don't remember the conservatives during the Iraq War when the Saddam Hussein statue fell in Baghdad. I don't recall Republicans at the time going, big mistake. You don't want to erase your history. That's your history. Leave it be. So, the plaque on the statue is not history. It doesn't say, this motherfucker thought that he should fight a war to ensure that he could have slaves on his plantation, that he could still benefit, and then we put it up to instill fear in the people that we kept as slaves and their descendants. So this should have been done in short order by a normal functioning society years ago.
All right. So I think we talked enough about monuments. Well, I want to talk a little bit more just about the outside of that. There's one article from Smithsonian. Definitely check it out. Smithsonian Taxpayer Costs of Confederate Memorials. They did this investigative research on how much we're actually paying. Our tax money is actually going to support these upkeeps. So, because a lot of these monuments are on public land, and these memorials, like Jefferson Davis said, his entire home was built into this memorial, and that we're paying for all that. So they found that in the last 10 years, U.S. taxpayers, starting in 2018, in the last 10 years, spent $40 million on Confederate monuments. So we're spending millions of dollars every year to upkeep this lie, basically, to upkeep monuments. And this investigative journalist, they actually went even farther, and they actually went undercover into some of these the heritage sites, like the Jefferson Davis, and what they found was it was pretty disturbing. They found that so there was this tour guide at the Jefferson Davis home and presidential library that was dressed up in this antebellum big flowing dress, and walking around telling school groups, because every day they host dozens of schools, and they go around and give these lectures on this area, and this is what the actual tour guide of the Jefferson Davis home actually said. I want to tell them the honest truth, that slavery was good and bad. While there were some hateful slave owners, it was good for the people that didn't know how to take care of themselves, and they needed a job. And you had good slave owners like Jefferson Davis, who took care of his slaves and treated them like family. He loved them. This was in 2018. This woman that we're paying her salary and paying the upkeep of these, Jefferson Davis's home, is telling, dozens of school groups every day. And one of those people that actually visited this site just before he killed 9 African Americans in the church was Dylan Roof in 2015. Right before he committed his atrocities and killed a bunch of Black people in the name of supporting white supremacy, he spent the day touring memorial plantations, including Jefferson Davis's home, which is selling this idea that white people are the real victims and we're under attack by this corrupt northern government and business interests and Black people. So this is directly related to the white terrorism that we're experiencing today. So Heidi Barrett from Southern Poverty Law Center says, Confederate sites play to the white supremacist imagination. They are treated as sacred by white supremacists and represent what this country should be and what it would have been if the Civil War had not been lost. And then one of our videos talked a little bit about the Confederate flag myth, that this idea that the South has always been flying, Confederate flags ever since the Civil War, and this is our heritage, when in reality, no one flew the Confederate flag for almost a good century until Strom Thurmond and the Dixiecrats who ran this camp, this third party called the Dixiecrats in the 50s, in direct opposition to segregation. And their main platform was they were opposing the segregation, the school segregation, and all, particularly and the civil rights bills that they saw coming. So that's when they brought back the Confederate flag, not as like a heritage symbol, but as a support for segregation. So Logan Strother wrote, for several decades after the Civil War, the Confederate battle emblem, the flag, was rarely displayed, typically only during tributes to actual Confederate veterans. It was not part of state flags or official symbols or displays. It wasn't until 1948 that the Confederate flag reemerged as a potent political symbol. The reason was the Dixiecrat revolt, when Strom Thurmond led a walkout of white Southerners from the Democratic National Convention to protest Harry S. Truman's push for civil rights. The Dixiecrats began to use the Confederate flag, which sparked further public interest in it. Consequently, the flag became strongly linked to white supremacy in opposition to civil rights for African Americans. In 1954, the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education, which ordered the desegregation of public primary schools, focused the energies and ire of the hardcore segregationists throughout the South. Efforts to resist school integration and other civil rights protections for African Americans included the display of Confederate symbols, and especially the Confederate battle flag. Many of these lost cause beliefs are still prevalent today throughout the country. 7 states still celebrate the Confederate Memorial Day as a public holiday. Textbooks still whitewash the Civil War, and people throughout the U.S. still celebrate the Confederate flag and violently oppose any attempts to remove the Confederate statue. Which I will say, in this past election, there was a victory. I believe it was Mississippi just voted to redesign their flag, which they were using the old Confederate flag. So there is some progress with some of this. So Equal Justice Initiative created this great video around the truth around Confederate name schools, which is something that we also see. Not only were they textbooks being whitewashed and flags, Confederate flags being brought back and monuments being built, but also schools were being named after Confederate generals. Particularly disturbing is a lot of Black schools were named after Confederate generals.
This is Ashley. She's 15 years old and a freshman at Robert E. Lee High School. Her school was named after, well, Robert E. Lee, the man who commanded the Army of the Confederate States of America. That army waged a brutal war against the United States, fighting to maintain a society in which Black people were enslaved and violently exploited. Today, Ashley's school provides a daily reminder of this history by honoring the men who insisted they had a right to enslave people like her. And she's not alone in this experience. The vast majority of the students at Lee High School are Black, like her. Strange as it may seem, Ashley's situation is far from unusual. In fact, there are hundreds of schools in the United States that are named after people who fought to preserve slavery and racial hierarchy. Almost all of them are public schools. and most serve student bodies that are majority non-white. How did this happen? The schools reflect not only a legacy of the Confederacy, but the more recent and long-lasting history of white resistance to racial equality. Throughout American history, Black communities have sought to educate themselves at almost all costs. Even when, during their time of enslavement, it was illegal for a Black person to learn to read and write. For most of that time, however, states and institutions have been hostile to the idea of Black education, seeking instead to reinforce a mythology of racial difference in which Black children are seen as less capable and less deserving of the same educational opportunities afforded to white children. This hostility was particularly active in the 1950s and 1960s, when Black Americans fought to integrate public schools. In 1954, when the Supreme Court outlawed school segregation in Brown versus Board of Education, many white Americans were outraged. In response, many white-dominated communities in the United States simply refused to integrate their schools. Instead, they built new, state-of-the-art schools open to white children only. To make their message especially clear, many of these schools were named after Confederate leaders who defended slavery, like Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, and Stonewall Jackson. This was the case with Lee High, which was built and named in 1955, just 1 year after Brown, and opened as a white-only school. In many communities, this refusal continued for decades. Even though schools were no longer explicitly white-only, communities adopted many strategies to maintain de facto segregation. Naming schools after Confederate leaders was one such strategy. It was a way to signal that white Southerners would resist integration by any means necessary, and it served to reinforce racial hierarchies by referencing a terrifying and violent history. As public schools eventually began to open their doors to Black children, white students fled to private schools. Now, the majority of white children in Ashley's home city go to private schools, while many of its Black children have no choice but to attend the public schools whose names celebrate people who fought to preserve slavery and white supremacy. Truth and justice require us to confront our history honestly and commit ourselves to dismantling the legacy of racial injustice. This will require changing the names of schools that dishonor the nation's commitment to equality and justice for all.
Right, and so our next class is going to be about racial segregation. So we're going to talk more about how a lot of these, Confederate named schools were created as ways to avoid desegregation after the Brown versus Board 1954 desegregation federal, Supreme Court order. All right, and then we talked about a little bit earlier about Confederate Memorial Day. So this is an actual holiday that several states, Alabama, Mississippi, and South Carolina, celebrate. And 5 states, actually Texas and Florida, 3 states actually close down government offices and make it an official holiday. Which is crazy. I mean, this is one of the parades. I mean, imagine being a Black person growing up in one of these towns in like Alabama, and then seeing these parades, all to cherish just the people who fought to enslave you. It's a lot to handle. And then in addition to that, several states holidays for several states have created Confederate holidays around Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee, and arguably one of the most disturbing holidays was just a recent invention. Tennessee in 2019, last year, just created Nathan Bedford Forrest Day. So Nathan Bedford Forrest he was a Confederate general, a slave trader, and he was the first Grand Wizard of the KKK. And he was also carried out during the Civil War when he captured a bunch of, he was a Confederate general, when he captured a bunch of Black soldiers and white soldiers, he massacred all of them. So he actually committed a massacre against U.S. soldiers, but that's overlooked because he's such a great supporter of and symbol of white supremacy. So Tennessee literally made them created a holiday around that. And one myth I want to talk about, because this is something that it's not, it's not one of the main narratives, but it's definitely a narrative that's pushed by the Lost Cause, is this idea that Black people fought in the Southern Army. And this is something I've heard all my life. I've had, grew up with like, people who do reenactment folks, and they always talk about how, Black people fought in the South. And there was this idea that, Black people, that kind of pushing this lost cause, that slavery really wasn't that bad, and Black people actually, enjoyed their situation enough to risk their life and fight for their situation. There's actually a book that was recently written. David Smith, he wrote Black Confederates, Exploding America's Most Persistent Myth, where he spent an enormous amount of time trying to research and find any actual free Black soldiers. What he found was tons of white soldiers who brought their enslaved Black people to along with them into their camps, and forced them to work and do a lot of labor, but that he couldn't find actual free Black men signing up. So I'm going to read this one quote from his book. The American Civil War has never been in short supply of myths, but Levin describes Black Confederates as the most persistent. Hundreds of articles, organizations, and websites rewrite history by asserting that between 500 and 100,000 free and enslaved African Americans volunteered as soldiers in the Army fighting to preserve slavery. Just because it is counterintuitive does not mean, and that does not make it true. What was central to the Lost Cause was that they believed and maintained that their enslaved people remained loyal to them and the Confederacy until the very end. So another way of just lost cause myth of just downplaying the horrors of slavery by saying that, it can't be that bad. There was Black people actually signing up to fight to defend it. Just not true. So Southern Poverty Law Center, SPLC, the ones that did the map, the Confederate Monument map, they actually did this really extensive study in 2017 to try to understand. They called it the Teaching Hard History Report, and it mainly looked at, we looked at a lot of things, but primarily looked at how we are teaching the history of slavery in the Civil War and the legacy of slavery in this country, and what they found. Even to this day, even though the Lost Cause books are gone in the 70s, they still are finding out even to this day some pretty disturbing trends around this. So I'm gonna read these first three statistics. High school seniors struggle on even the most basic questions about American enslavement, Africans. Only 8% of high school seniors surveyed can identify slavery as the central cause of the Civil War. 8%. 2/3, 68% don't know that it took a constitutional amendment to formally end slavery. Fewer than 1 in 4 students, 22%, can correctly identify how provisions in the Constitution gave advantages to slaveholders. And that's I know. I don't know the exact number. I know it was a big survey. It was like thousands of people, students they surveyed. That's pretty disturbing. And then at the same time, they found that many teachers, were serious about teaching slavery, but they lacked a deep coverage of the subject. A lot of them talked about how their textbooks were very inadequate. Something like half of the teachers complained that their textbooks did a very poor job, teaching slavery, and they didn't feel like they had the resources to kind of supplement that. The best, popular textbooks, they also analyzed textbooks on the coverage of slavery and found that Beck's textbook achieved a score of 70% against our rubric of what should be included in the study of American slavery. So the average score, this was a rubric they created based on the fundamental principles of the slavery and how it relates to our country, and they found the majority of textbooks, failed pretty bad on this rubric. They also found many state standards, they found, I'll read this last line, of the 15 sets of state standards we analyzed, none addresses how the ideology of white supremacy rose to justify the institution of slavery. Most failed to lay out meaningful requirements for learning about slavery, about the lives of millions of enslaved people, or about their labor was essential to the American economy. So these three things we're talking about, not only downplaying slavery, but also removing it from the creation of our country. Our country was founded on slavery, and that has been whitewashed. And also, more importantly, white supremacy was created, this ideology that advantages white people in all of our institutions, that was created to justify slavery and to continue to control slavery. And when that went away, slavery went away, white supremacy never did. But we don't talk about white supremacy at all, or in the majority of our schools, or you don't talk about our standards don't have it, our textbooks don't have it, and that's what makes oftentimes makes white supremacy so powerful, is that invisibility. There was the Southern Poverty Law Center. They found 7 key problems with current teachings of slavery. I definitely recommend, especially if you're a teacher, to check out this. They go in depth with all this stuff. But I'm just going to summarize a couple of them. First one is we teach about slavery without context, preferring to present the good news before the bad. We talk about Underground Railroad and Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, while not teaching very little about understanding how slave labor built the nation. We tend to subscribe to this progressive view of American history that we can acknowledge flaws only to the extent that they have been addressed. So this is a common thing. We saw in that John Oliver's video, that parent, was saying, why do we have to, teach negative things? Why can't we just teach about, how we overcame slavery? We can only talk about bad things that we overcame, but the reality is we have not overcome the legacies of it. We teach about American enslavement of Africans as an exclusively Southern institution. In fact, slavery was experienced throughout the majority of the country, especially in the North, and there was also different forms of it. It was, in the West, like California would have slave markets for indigenous people. So it was, this is something our entire country was founded on and experienced, and we don't talk about that in our schools. I think number 4 is probably the most important thing. We rarely connect slavery to the ideology that grew up and sustained and protected it, white supremacy. So in fact, the American ideology of white supremacy, along with accompanying racist dogma, developed precisely to justify perpetuation of slavery. So we created all these ideologies and created these institutions based on these ideologies, racist ideologies, all for slavery. But when slavery ended, we left all of it in place, and that's what we're still dealing with today. I think the number 6 is a big one. We rarely make connections to the present. How can students develop a meaningful understanding of the rest of American history if they do not understand the scope and lasting impact of enslavement, Reconstruction, the Great Migration, the Harlem Renaissance, the Civil Rights movements do not make sense when so divorced from the arc of American history. That's the big ones. We don't connect these past things to how they were, to the realities of today. And that, if you did watch this, I played this clip at the beginning of the show. Well, I didn't play it, I can't play John Oliver clips or HBO clips anymore because of the copyrights, but I sent people to the YouTube to watch it. But he makes a great claim that what they found, they did an extensive study as well on history, being taught. And they found these 3 concepts: that we don't fully acknowledge white supremacy, we view history's progress as if it was constant and inevitable, and we don't connect the dots to the present. And they found that these 3 things are really hurting us because we don't do this in our schools. We don't acknowledge our history of white supremacy and how it's still with us today. We don't, acknowledge that, we sell this idea that we've been in this constant state of progress, overcoming things when that is anything but true. There's a reality we're still dealing with a lot of things, and we have come a long way in certain areas, but in other areas we have not at all. And then and the last thing, we don't connect the dots to the present. Is probably the most important reason, because how are you going to understand the realities today, the injustices today, the racial disparities, the movements that we know today, if you don't connect that from our history? So this is a quote from the Teaching Hard History report from, I really thought this was powerful. American enslavement of Africans defined the nature and limits of American liberty. It influenced the creation and development of major political and social institutions of the nation, and it was a cornerstone of American prosperity that fueled our industrial revolution. It's not simply an event in our history, it's central to our history. Slavery's long reach continues into the present day. The persistent and wide social, economic, and legal disparities that African Americans face today, and the backlash that seems to follow every African American advancement, trace their roots to slavery and its aftermath. If we are to understand the world today, we must understand slavery's history and continuing impact. So we talked about slavery and the lost cause and all that, but there's another, this got wrapped up in the lost cause, but this was this new entity of whitewashing called the Dunning School. And this has to do about a Reconstruction. And I think for a majority of us, if you ask about what Reconstruction is, I would say the majority of people would not do not know. I was never taught about Reconstruction, or if I was, it was like one sentence and I forgot about it. And then the few people that do know about Reconstruction, they have the Dunning School perspective that it was a corrupt time full of corrupt Black politicians and white, Northerners and carpetbaggers and scallywags, and it was a pretty horrific time. And then white people, redeemers of the old Confederates, kind of fixed the situation and took back control. Is in the general narrative. And in reality, that's far from true. So Reconstruction was about a decade after the Civil War, when there was an attempt to make an egalitarian society in the South, where they gave they gave Black people the right to vote. 2,000 Black politicians were elected on all different levels. They created all kinds of amazing policies, from building a public school system in the South to all different kinds of really amazing. I mean, it was a very successful government. But ultimately it was white supremacy, it was KKK, terrorism, voter suppression, all these different things that ultimately through it, they removed the Black people's ability to vote. And then by 1877, the federal government had removed their troops from the South on this compromise for the Hayes election, and then white supremacy dominated for the next century. So it was a very tragic, time to see this happening. But the way we talk about this is completely opposite. So Adam Sewer writes, one of the 16, who wrote this article about the 1619 Project, wrote, for decades, a group of white historians known as the Dunning School, after the Columbia University historian William Archibald Dunning, portrayed Reconstruction as a tragic period of, in his words, the scandalous misrule of the carpetbaggers and Negroes, brought on by misguided enfranchisement of Black men. As the historian Eric Foner has written, the Dunning School and its interpretations of Reconstruction helped provide moral and historical cover for the Jim Crow system. In Black Reconstruction in America, W.E. Du Bois challenged the consensus of white historians who ascribed the faults and failures of Reconstruction to Negro ignorance and corruption, and offered what is now considered a more reliable account of the era as an imperfect but noble effort to build a multiracial democracy in the South. And that's important to understand, because this new narrative that, it wasn't perfect. Of course, there was things that were wrong with any government, but overall it was a very powerful and good government during Reconstruction time. But instead, the Dunning School and all these historians rewrote it as this very horrible and corrupt time. Gone with you see this in media, Gone with the Wind was all about escaping this. I'll show you a clip in the next slide, or next slide or two, about Birth of the Nation and how the KKK supposedly saved us from this horrible, corrupt government. What it did is it created the historical, provide moral and historical cover for the Jim Crow system. So it allowed for this, new system of Jim Crow and lynching and all this horrific, sharecropping to emerge, and voter suppression in the name of saying, well, we gave Black people a chance. They were all corrupt and horrible, so we had to take it back over. And now we need to, maintain a white supremacy rule for the safety of everyone. So Eric Foner also writes, the tradition of Dunning School of Reconstruction was not just an interpretation of history, it was part of the edifice of the Jim Crow system. It was an explanation for and justification of taking the right to vote away from Black people on the grounds that they completely abused it during Reconstruction. There was a justification for white South resisting other outside efforts and changing racial relations because of the worry of having another Reconstruction. All of the alleged horrors of Reconstruction helped to freeze the mind of the white South and resistance to any change whatsoever. And it was only after the Civil Rights Revolution swept away the racist underpinning of that old view, for example, that Black people are incapable of taking part in American democracy, that you can get a new view of Reconstruction widely accepted. For a long time, it was an intellectual straitjacket for much of the white South, and historians have a lot to answer for in helping to propagate a racist system in this country. So all of this narrative was created by what we call the Dunning School of Reconstruction, and this is a legacy of white historians that we still see to this day. A lot of the opposition to the 1619 Project, has roots in this Dunning School of a lot of these white historians, that they don't argue against the 1619 Project's the facts. They argue about what parts were the significance of certain of things, like the significance around slavery with the birth of our country. So I want to read all these quotes, but I want to read one, just one from Clint Smith, telling the truth about slavery is not indoctrination. He writes, he starts off with Du Bois' quote, "We have too often a deliberate attempt so to change the facts of history that the story will make pleasant reading for Americans." Du Bois was writing during a moment when the narrative of slavery as a benevolent, amicable arrangement between the enslaver and enslaved had come to dominate America's collective memory of that historical period. Many Americans saw slavery as an arrangement in which Black people were happy to serve the white people who owned them, and in which those who owned them treat their laborers with a paternal and generous kindness. Such a narrative was propagated by a Columbian historian, Ulrich Bonnell Phillips, whose 1918 book, American Negro Slavery, would shape how white Americans misunderstood the institutions. On the whole, Phillips wrote, the plantations were the best schools yet invented for the mass training of a sort of inert and backward people, which the bulk of American Negroes represented. As a graduate student, Phillips studied under the historian William A. Dunning, namesake of the Dunning School, which was not a physical institution, but a racist intellectual movement. The Dunning School's legacy includes entrenching within American public consciousness the idea that following the Civil War, Black people had proved for themselves through both elected office and suffrage incapable of participating in democracy. As the historian Eric Foner has put it, the traditional or Dunning School of Reconstruction was not just an interpretation of history, it was part of the edifice of the Jim Crow system. At the core of Phillips' scholarships was the idea that slavery was in fact an inhumane institution predicated on physical and psychological torture, and that its role in the growth of the American economy was minimal. Or was not, in fact, an inhumane institution. Sorry. So, I mean, this wraps up this whole new ideology, this Dunning School of Reconstruction. It starts, getting mixed in with rising new birth of media culture. Like, for example, The Birth of a Nation was this, it's revolutionary. When it comes to like movies in themselves, was this revolutionary movie that that really revolutionized media in general and movies in general at the time. But it was also this super, they were basically telling the Dunning, the false racist myth of Reconstruction. I'm just going to play this one clip of how they portrayed this in Reconstruction in this movie, and then I'll just play this real quick. So this is Birth of a Nation. so that's a little clip of like I think it's like 4 hour long movie, and essentially, black people were just out of control, raping and pillaging the South, and then the Ku Klux Klan had to come save the day. And this movie, I mean, it was played all over the country, and majority of white people throughout the country were completely segregated for black people. So imagine, never, seeing a black person and then watching this movie as a child, and then imagine growing up and with those views as you start, think as like schools started to desegregate and things like that. So it's really impactful. Even like Woodrow Wilson and many politicians and Supreme Court justices watched this movie and really enjoyed it. So what the last couple of slides, just want to end on a couple other thoughts. So Caroline Randall Williams, she wrote this really great article. I believe it was this year, if not late last year. She wrote, "You want a Confederate monument? My body is a Confederate monument." And it's a little long, but it's worth reading. I definitely would recommend reading the whole entire article. But she wrote, "The black people I come from were owned and raped by the white people I come from. Who dares to tell me to celebrate them? I have rape-colored skin. My light brown blackness is a living testament to the rules, the practices, the causes of the Old South. If there are those who want to remember the legacy of the Confederacy, if they want monuments, well, then my body is a monument. My skin is a monument. I am a black Southern woman, and of my immediate white male ancestors, all of them are rapists. My very existence is a relic of slavery and Jim Crow. According to the rule of hypodescent, the social and legal practice of assigning genetically mixed race persons to the race with less social power, I am a daughter of 2 black people and a granddaughter of 4 black people, the great-granddaughter of 8 black people. Go back one more generation and it gets less straightforward and more sinister. As far as my family history has always told me, as modern DNA testing has allowed me to confirm, I am a descendant of black women who were domestic servants and white men who raped their help. It's extraordinary truth of my life that I am biologically more than half white, and yet I have no white people in my genealogy and living memory, no voluntary whiteness. I am more than half white, and none of it was consensual. White Southern men, my ancestors, took what they wanted from women they did not love, over whom they had extraordinary power, and then failed to claim their children. What is the monument but a standing memory, an artifact to make tangible in the truth of the past? My body and blood are tangible truth of the South and its past. The black people I come from were owned by the white people I come from. The white people I come from fought and died for their lost cause. And I ask you now, who dare tells me to celebrate them? Who dares to ask me to accept their monument pedestals? Our ancestors don't deserve your unconditional pride. Yes, I'm proud of every one of my black ancestors who survived slavery. They earned that pride by any decent person's reckoning, but I am not proud of the white ancestors whom I know by virtue of my very existence to be bad actors. Among the apologists for the Southern cause and for its monuments, there are those who dismiss the hardships of the past. They imagine a world of benevolent masters who speak with misty eyes of gentility and honor and the land. They deny plantation rape or explain it away or question the degree of frequency with which it occurred. To those people, it is my privilege to say I am proof. I am proof that whatever else the South might have been or might believe itself to be, it was and is a space whose prosperity and sense of romance and nostalgia were built upon grievous exploitation of Black life. And just to follow that up, a lot of what Caroline Randall Williams found out about her life came from these new DNA testing, the genealogy, Ancestry.com, and what we're seeing right now is even Ancestry.com is starting to whitewash history. Let me read this quote by Adam H. Domdy. In the past year, Ancestry changed its search engine to detach the history of slavery from basic genealogical inquiries. While searching for an individual's name, Ancestry.com stopped including results from the 1850 or 1860 United States Census slave schedules. This means that someone searching for ancestors might discover a wealthy progenitor with no record of the foundations of that wealth, making it all too easy to claim, as many privileged white American families do, that their individual family earned its fortune outside of slavery, despite the central role slavery had in the shaping of nation politics, economics, culture, and society. Before this change occurred, Ancestry.com subscribers would have often had to face the uncomfortable fact that their family kept others enslaved. Bad historical knowledge can lead modern equities and to appear as solely at the fault of the impoverished and not the product of centuries of discrimination. In this twisted worldview, affirmative action can be understood as reverse discrimination because historically created inequality does not appear to even exist. Denying the existence of institutional racism produced by a long history of oppression serves to maintain inequality today. The danger of hiding slavery's extent, horrors, and legacy is that it leads Americans to fundamentally misunderstand why racism remains such a problem. And you can't solve a problem until you understand if you do not understand the roots. I think that last paragraph just perfectly summarizes why why I'm doing this entire class, why people are even concerned about whitewashing. Is the fact that it affects modern policies. It affects this line, bad historical knowledge can lead modern inequities to appear as solely the fault of impoverished and not the product of centuries of discrimination. And if you believe that, that these impoverished people, it's their own fault, and you don't know the history of why they're impoverished, you're going to elect people that are going to continue that history, that are going to defend, white people and defend the way of life, instead of trying to actually heal and fix our past injustices. So this is the last slide. I want to leave this on Paul Butler. He's a professor at Georgetown University Law Center. It was a really quick video, but it just perfectly summarizes a honest Black person's reaction to a white person calling the Confederacy their heritage.
On the other side, you've got Georgetown law professor Paul Butler, who had this response to a caller on NPR who descended from Confederate veterans.
I think we need to focus on gun control and not be sidetracked by this. But I'm not somebody who thinks the battle flag should stay there, but I certainly honor my ancestors.
I have no respect for your ancestors. As far as your ancestors is concerned, I shouldn't be a law professor at Georgetown. I should be a slave. That's why they fought that war. I don't understand what it means to be proud of a legacy of terrorism and violence. Last week at this time, I was in Israel. The idea that a German would say, that thing we did called the Holocaust, that was wrong, but I respect the courage of my Nazi ancestors, that wouldn't happen. The reason people can say what you said in the United States is because, again, Black life just doesn't matter to a lot of people.
All right, so we'll leave it at that. I think that last line perfectly summarizes this entire section.